day 2, session 3, post-lunch, and it's called Communities Chemistry. Right? Fair warning right at the beginning, like Chinmay said, this can get explosive, but that's the kind of session you want post-lunch, right?
No, the Parsis are a peace-loving people, nothing explosive.
What rubbish.
Bakhtiyar. Come on. We will come to that. Hang on. All right. So, you've actually got an introduction for all of us. But before we start this session, just a clarification, like Chinmay said, I identify mostly with being an archivist, so which basically means there is a certain way in which I think linear. I'm always looking to complete a story. And even over here, what I'm trying to do with these two, he's already laughing. What I'm trying to do is understand the two communities. We're going to go through a journey. They're both biographers in a way, right? He's a biographer of a community. And of course, Bakhtiyar himself has written several biographies. So we're going to go on this journey of these two communities, touch upon their origins a little bit, figure out if knowing this origin even matters in today's day and age. We go on to the community's engagement with political life, with economic life along the way. We're going to laugh at ourselves. We are going to break some myths. And we're going to perhaps even try and explain a few stereotypes. So with that, if you're ready, I was just curious, and I'm going to start with Bakhtiyar, just so that, you know, there is structure a little bit. There is one of your books, Sugar and Milk, is an invocation of that legend that we've all heard of, right? Parsis coming to India, mixing with the local population. I would want you to reflect on, in today's day and age, tell us that story, tell us a little more about that origin, and reflect on whether that kind of identity still matters.
Thank you, Sanghamitra. Let me give you a little background before I come to this myth or legend, as it's called, of sugar and milk. Now, the Parsis owe their ancestry and their religion to pre-Islamic Zoroastrian era. And they, after the last Sasanian king, I think it was Yazdegerd III, who lost in the Battle of Nehavand, they were on the run ever since then. So they first went to a place called Khorasan, then they went to Hormuzd, an island in the Persian Gulf, and from there they came to India. They first landed in Diu, where they stayed for 19 years. After that, then they came to the western coast of Gujarat, which somewhere near what we now know as Sanjan. So when they first landed there, I mean, there is this feeling that the Parsis all came together in one shipload and landed in Sanjan. Well, that's not true. That's just a myth. The Parsis had already come to India as traders through the land route. So well before this migration, marine migration took place, they were already in India. So there is this myth of them, coming on a hazardous sea voyage and to save their religion. Well, I suppose some of them did come on the sea route, but most of them came as traders and settled in India. Now, coming to the myth of sugar and milk, which Sanghamitra is talking about, the story goes, now this story has been narrated in an epic poem called Kisse Sanjan by a Parsi priest, Baman Kaikobad, who wrote about it in 1599. So it is in all probability apocryphal, it is a myth, it's a legend, but it makes for a good story. So the story is this, that a whole bunch of strange people land up in Sanjan and ask the king, Jadi Rana, for sanctuary. Now Jadi Rana doesn't know who he's faced with, so he comes with a bowl of milk filled to the brim, indicating that, look, there's no place for you guys, please go back. So there's this wise Parsi priest who puts a, we will be, we will enhance the population without overwhelming it. So impressed by this symbolism, Jadi Rana gives them sanctuary. But there were a few conditions which were attached to the sanctuary. He says that you will forsake your weapons, you will adopt the local language and customs, and one very important one is that you will only marry in the evening and in the night, not during the day. As to why this was done, I don't know. No one has been able to explain it to me, but this was one of the preconditions. Yeah, nor did I, until recently.
Okay.
That is the myth of the sugar.
But you know, that's kind of fun, no? Evening weddings.
Oh yeah,
night
a lot of
weddings.
fun. You can eat more,
Yeah.
then go to sleep.
But also the other thing, and we'll come to that later, one of the, the localization, the language and all of that, we'll come to that later. But I'm going to draw Shradeep in, but I want you to, if you will indulge me a little bit, I'm very fascinated by, we'll go a little personal, I'm very fascinated by Devi Prasad, your grandfather. Right? And if you could just take us through a little bit about Kushtia, how he lands up in Kushtia, and what does that say about that aspect to Bengali movement?
I will indulge you, but not right now. Because I don't know if this is perhaps a time and place for it, but I promise you that in some part of our conversation this afternoon, I'll ensure that this retelling or recalling happens. That's a promise. And fun things happened with my grandfather. I mean, he invited guys like Jadunath Sarkar over for talks and all kinds of things. Fun stuff, but for a little later. And maybe just to sort of do a logical segue from the question that you asked, Bakhtiar, about sort of origin stories and about sugar and milk. Maybe I could launch into a bit of that, if you don't mind.
So, yeah, I was also, fascinated with that. I didn't know till, we had that conversation a couple of days ago. But, the entire origin of the Bengali community, whatever from the scriptures.
No.
And geez, did we fight on the side of the Kauravas? Is that
Well,
true?
that's part of the origin myth. But ladies and gentlemen, and my colleagues here, I must clarify one thing straight away. Origin myths of the Bengalis become all the more necessary because Bengalis believe, at least Bengalis of today, or for the past couple of hundred years at least, believe that we are born of an immaculate conception. We arrived fully formed on earth somewhere in the 1830s and 1840s, along with Raja Ram Mohan Roy. There's been nothing prior to that, with possible exception of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And you can't say bad things about him. He was actually a syncretic kind of guy. I want to talk about that as well this afternoon. Very important in today's context. That, of course, that kind of idea about an immaculate conception is, of course, a grand immaculate misconception. And I want to begin with that because Bengalis are also under the misconception that we are a race, for instance. Unlike my colleague over here, we're not a race, we're a people. We are a mongrel people.
Sudeep, I'd like to correct you there. Parsis are not a race in the technical sense of the term. Yeah. And after 100,000 years of miscegenation, I think we are very, very Indian. So,
all right.
Yeah.
No.
So, in the anthropological sense, Parsis are certainly not a race.
I don't mean
the
it in
Caucasian and the Mongoloid and the rest.
I don't mean it in an anthropological sense in that particular case.
But more an ethnic group, you can say.
Yeah. So my point exactly. So therefore, the Bengalis are essentially an ethno-linguistic group, and that's what I want to get at, where we are drawn from all over. And if you want to talk about the Bengalis, in fact, we were not always cultured as we claim to be today. I mean, I have very different opinion about that as well. We'll talk about all that. But I recall a time from about 5th to 6th century BCE, before the Common Era, where Mahavir, which the gentleman came to visit us in western, what is today Western West Bengal, an area called Rar. And it's written about in the next couple of centuries in a sutra called the Acharanga Sutra, where the Jain Munis actually said that, you know, we went into this wild area and we met some very wild people. And in fact, when Mahavir visited, evidently my forebears let dogs onto his party and basically kicked the Jains out. And we were not very welcoming even back then. There's another interesting aspect, and I think there were, in the Acharanga Sutra, there are actually words to the effect of saying, chu, chu, you know, like get the hell out of here, kind of thing. So we were not always immaculately cultured or hospitable or grand, whatever. Then we have an instance of mentions, honorable mentions, both in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, where there are kings of Vanga who were variously mentioned. So that is another misconception, perhaps this time by people who are not Bengali, that Bengalis do not have a sort of a, they might have marital prowess but not martial prowess, if I may be so bold as to say that, where the kings of Vanga were part of the campaign on the right side in Ramayana, and on the wrong side they went with the Kauravas in Mahabharata and brought vast armies of elephants onto the field and discharged their duties honorably. Of course, everybody died, that's another story. But we were on the side of the Kauravas. And so on and so forth. And I think what we begin to see, which many Bengalis refuse to believe, I think we need to mention this because of all the kind of glorification that accrues to the Bengali person or the sense of Bengali self, where but when the Pal dynasty was in Bengal, so you're talking about the end of the first millennium in the Common Era to about the 2nd century in the 2nd millennium, the Pals were really the people who helped with the migration of Prakrit into what you might call Proto-Bengali, the early Bengali. Then the Sens came after that. They came in from southern India, merged with the Bengali, or what was Vanga, various parts of Vanga. They propagated it as well. And after that, which is important to keep in mind, is that through the Islamic era of Bengal, through the time of the early sultanates and through the Hussain Shahis and through all of that, through the time when, Charyapadas were written, Charyapada was written during the time of during the Pals, but after that, all our Mahakavyas, Mahakabbos, were developed during the Islamic period. So there was a continuous sort of propagation of Bengali. Bengali began to coalesce as a language, a sort of a discipline where people were moving from grand epic poetry to hagiographic poetry to hagiographic text to religious text, and then slowly breaking into, with the advent of the British, breaking into the form that we today know as Bengali literature. That was sort of the proto-Bengali literature. The point I'm trying to make is really that we've evolved as a people, and we've primarily evolved as a people. Our main identity, which we don't always realize, with all the overhang of culture and presumptions and assumptions, is on account of language. I mean, we are Bengalis today. We are Bangalis.
I was just going to ask, who is a Bengali?
Yeah,
Therefore,
I'm sorry?
I was just going to ask, therefore, who is a Bengali then?
I'm precisely attempting to answer that, if I may, is that I think we're an aggregate of our identity as people who speak Bangla as a first stop. That is, I think, the derivative of, we are from Vanga, Bengala, Bengal, various parts of the delta, the Gangetic Delta, Brahmaputra Delta, Meghna, and so on and so forth. But I think what brought us together is the language. And I'll give you a living proof of that, which not many Bengalis, at least the Bengalis in West Bengal, are too fond of, is that you actually had a situation, and I want to I'll just mention it and I'll stop here. And I hope I'm provocative enough, but I hope I'm realistic enough. I'll bring to you an example of the Bengali language, where in what is today Bangladesh, which used to be East Pakistan, which used to be Bengal, there are people who actually voted to be with Pakistan on account of religion. And when Mr. Jinnah in 1948 went to Dhaka and announced that Urdu would be the state language of Pakistan, began a linguistic protest. So the same people who were part of the Muslim League and sort of broke away from Bengal, today's West Bengal, or the Indian Bengal, and formed the East Bengal, or the Pakistani Bengal, switched back because they wanted to speak, read, and write in Bangla. Then the language became the primary issue. It was not these are people who broke away on account of religion, but they broke away even more. The third partition of Bengal, 1971, happened on account of the need, primarily the need to speak, read, and write in Bangla. So language, ladies and gentlemen, is to me, and they paid a blood sacrifice for it. Between 2 and 3 million Bengalis died in order to speak, read, and write Bangla. There's a blood sacrifice that is accrued to this language. In Assam as well, there was a Bhasha Andolan there as well. But that's for another story for another time. But I'm just trying to trace my people, who we are. We are very many things. We are many, many things, and we'll talk about all that. But I think what we really are, we are a language. We speak the language. We speak a common language. And we speak a common language in this sort of area which has developed its own sort of geographic syntax, its own geographic grammar, its own political grammar, its own political syntax, its own sort of syntax and grammar of peace and love and violence and culture and food and sense of self and sense of the future and all kinds of sense of chaos, everything. But it's all really, it begins with the formation of us as through the sutra, if you will, through the river systems of language. And then we are very many things. But I want to acknowledge this. And I would, you don't have to agree with me. As a Bengali, we've already begun to disagree. But that's the joy of it. That's also who we are. But language. I think that if we didn't have the language, we would have not much else to begin with. Everything flows from language.
I told you this would be explosive. But just taking a cue from what he was saying, and my own curiosity is to, therefore, who is a Bengali? I want to go back to Bakhtiyar right now and ask him the same question. And apparently, I'm not the first one to ask you this question as to who is a Parsi, because years, decades, a century ago, there was a legal case that defined who a Parsi was.
Hello. So coming to, if a language defines a Bengali, then I think ethnicity defines a Parsi. Okay.
You know, we will come to your language.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
The language of the Parsis in a bit.
Yeah, okay, you want to talk about that? We'll talk about that. Now, we have no language.
Yeah.
When we first landed in Sanjan, the king said, you adopt our language, you adopt our customs. We said, okay, fine, we have no go. So we started speaking Gujarati. But it wasn't the kind of Gujarati which the Gujaratis speak. And the Parsi is still an object of ridicule among people who speak a better version of the language. So we speak a pidgin version of Gujarati with all its eccentricities and idiosyncrasies. And that is why you have this stereotype in Hindi movies of a Parsi speaking Hindi or a Parsi speaking Gujarati in a very typical pidgin kind of way. So our identity has nothing to do with the language. It was taken when we came to, landed on the coast of Gujarat. Okay.
But since we are on the topic of language, let's explore that a little more. So the Parsi Gujarati, from what I believe, is a mix of the Pahlavi language. That was
no, not
that's
at all.
A myth?
Not at all, not at all.
And
nothing.
Gujarati, I was told, and that was the Gujarati of the workers
no,
or
nothing
something?
of the kind. Nothing of the kind. Our prayers are in Avastha, old Avastha, but there is nothing else connected to anything to do with that part of the world.
So, for instance, and I'll probably come back to you also with a similar question. If, in real terms, how different is the actual Gujarati? If you could give us a few examples. And, what are those words? What are those specifications in Parsi Gujarati?
Really won't be able to give you an example straight away, but you can at once recognize Gujarati being spoken by a Parsi and Gujarati being spoken by a Gujarati. There are a number of words, immediately I don't know what to say, but it's a very typical kind of idiosyncratic use of Gujarati. And similarly, we speak Hindi also in a very funny manner. Aata hai, jata hai, bolta hai, kya karta hai. You've been in Bombay, so you know what I mean. And
other things as well.
And Hindi speakers from the north are vastly amused by the way the Parsis, at least the Bombay Parsis, speak Gujarati. I've been in Delhi and all over India in the course of my job, so I would like to believe that I speak a bit chaste Hindi.
On this note,
I've given speeches in Hindi also, by the way. So
might I add that I actually covered Rusi Modi's campaign in Jamshedpur, and it was hilarious. He would walk into these villages in Singhbhum district and say, "Tumko malum hai hum kaun hota?" And they would look at him blankly, and then some Tata Steel executive would come and say, "Ye bada sahab hai, wo jo aapka wo school bana hai, ye bada sahab bana hai." And Rusi would kind of this sort of walk.
Talking about Rusi Modi, it's a slight aside, but I think it's an amusing one. Rusi Modi apparently parked his car just outside Bombay House, which is on Sir Homi Modi Street, which is named after his father. Okay, so there is that anecdote which says that the cop caught him and says, "Ye tere baap ka rasta hai kya?" So he says, "Haan, mere baap ka rasta hai." So coming back to Sanghamitra's question is, who is a Parsi? Now, prior about 1860 onwards, a Parsi was defined as a person who was a Zoroastrian, right? But as it turned out, that wasn't much of a definition, because in 1904 or 1903, when Ratanji Dadabhoy Tata, JRD's father, married a French woman called Suzanne Brière, he converted her to Zoroastrianism. He had the Navjot ceremony, thread ceremony performed, and wanted her to enter the fire temple and also enjoy all the benefits of Parsi institutions and Parsi funds. So there was a massive hue and cry among the Orthodox Parsis saying, she's a foreigner, she's a Firangi. How can you call her a Parsi? So they went to court over it. And this was possibly the most famous case in Parsi history. It was called the Parsi Panchayat case. So the plaintiff was, and her husband was one of the plaintiffs, but the main plaintiff was Sir Dinshaw Pettit. And on the other side, on the Bombay Parsi Panchayat side, was Sir Jamshedji Jijuboy. I think he was the 4th baronet. And there were 4-5 others. And R.D. Tata, Ratanji Dadabhoy Tata, was also one of the plaintiffs, since his wife, it was directly to his wife was involved. So, in name, the Bombay Division High Court, which consisted of one Parsi judge, Justice Dinshaw Dawar, and there was another Britisher called Justice, I think, Beeman. Now, they were supposed to adjudicate on 2 main points. One, were the trustees of the Bombay Parsi Panchayat legally appointed, and did they deserve to be there? Another was, can a foreigner or a non-Parsi who is converted to Zoroastrianism be considered a Parsi? So the actual point of debate and actual point on which they had to give a verdict was whether Suzanne Brière could enter a fire temple. So the first part was easily disposed of. They said no, the Bombay Parsi Panchayat is largely a self-appointed body. So legally they have no right, but they said that in the interest of the community, the current trustees can continue. So that part of the judgment went away very easily. Now it was the second part of the judgment in which Justice Dawar gave a very long judgment on who is a Parsi and can a convert be considered a Parsi. So Justice Dawar pointed to the ethnicity part of a Parsi and defined a Parsi as someone born of Parsi parents, the Iranis who settled in India and followed the Zoroastrian religion, and the offspring of a Parsi father and a non-Parsi mother. So this was his formulation, if you call it, if you want, for what Parsi identity meant. So in that, it was very clearly spelt out that Susan Brer, JRD's mother, was not a Parsi. And in this, there was another a very famous lawyer called J.D. Inverity involved. And he raised the point that yes, a Zoroastrian need not be a Parsi, but all Parsis should be Zoroastrians. Otherwise, there would be no meaning to a Parsi if he was not a Zoroastrian. So, you remain a Parsi for life. You can change your religion. As I'll come to a point later when we talk about it, Neville Wadia, or Nasli Wadia's father, he grew up as an Anglican, though he was born as a Parsi. So it was this judgment which ultimately laid down the law for the next maybe 90, 100 years. So it was based on this judgment that Parsis still decide who a Parsi is and who is not.
Yeah.
Because there are other Anjumans like the Delhi Parsi Anjuman, which is far more broad-minded. They allow the thread ceremony, Navjot ceremony of non-Parsi mothers and things like that. But in Bombay and in other places, no, not really.
But the non-Parsi mother is still an issue.
There have also been conversions of complete aliens. I think there was a person called George Peterson or Joseph Peterson or something way back in 1983. And he was in America, and in New York they performed this thread ceremony. Yeah, this is a vexed issue. It remains a very vexed issue. And there is one case which is still with the Supreme Court. And that involves a lady called Gulrukh Gupta. She married a Jain called Mahipal Gupta. And when her parents died, the Balsar Parsi Panchayat refused to allow her to perform the funerary rites. They said, you are not allowed into the fire temple, you can't go to the Dakma, as it were. So you no longer are a Parsi, because after getting married to your husband, it is deemed that you have converted to Hinduism. So she took the Parsi Panchayat to court over this. And the matter is still not been decided.
Of course, there's a case. Because if you don't know the Parsis, they're highly litigious. I was at one point of time doing the history of a club in Bombay. It was supposed to be a project that was supposed to be about 1.5 years long. That's the
Which
estimate,
club was this?
the Wellington Sports Club. It was supposed to be 1.5 years. The centenary came and went. 3 years later, the managing committee or the centenary committee was still arguing with each other. Chairman came and went, people sued each other, but the project took ultimately, I think it was in 2020 when their centenary was in 2017, the book released in 2020.
That's a very Bengali thing to do. I'm not sure you're talking about Parsis right now. But if I may add a sort of a Bengali touch to it, as a card-carrying, practicing Bengali, I actually did a biography of, or I attempted to do a biography of a Parsi business house. It shall go unnamed because I signed a non-disclosure agreement. And these so-and-sos, they made me sign a 25-year NDA. A 25-year non-disclosure agreement. Not a 5-year, not 6, not 7, not 10, 25 years. Anyway, that's about how. So your point is very well taken. On the count of, where are we going now?
Yeah.
Where do you want to
Let
go?
me add to the secrecy bit.
No, I mean,
Yeah, the Parsis are extremely possessive, and they don't allow you entry into. I mean, let me give you the example of when I was doing my biography of Homi Bhabha. The TIFR was loath to supply me with material, and I had to then meet the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, and through the Department of Atomic Energy, I managed to pry some of their documents out from the TIFR. So when the book was finally launched at TIFR, I told the director, I said, here is a nobody, scientific nobody, trying to write on your founder, and you you put every kind of impediment in my path.
That's also very Bengali.
So he
I'm
said-
not sure
he
where
said-
we're going
so
with
he
this.
said we have to preserve.
So,
we
I
have
know, I
to-
think that's
we have to
interesting
preserve our secrets.
because we've established Bengalis are argumentative. We've established that Parsis are
Are
litigious.
secretive and litigious and all
Yeah.
that, which are also.
But now tell me
I
something.
mean, Bengalis won't give you access simply because
Yeah.
they have woken up that morning and decided that they will not give you access that day. Maybe if you came back 3 days later, you might get tremendous access. So it's a mood thing, and Bengalis are a mood people. What can I say? But you were saying.
Yeah,
But
so I was
you were
just
saying.
saying now, I'm curious. Again, we have these two communities. Perhaps products of colonial education, that environment thrived during that period, for sure. And I'm just wondering, again, two different parts of the country, one in the west, one in the east. What kind of exchange, was there any kind of interaction, exchange that was happening between these two communities?
Absolutely. Loads of Parsis came to Bengal to make loads of money.
Opium? Did opium have anything to do
Absolutely. And so did Bengalis and Parsis were tremendously successful at trading in silver and opium. I mean, they were the sort of the vanguard of the East India Company. I'll give you an example of Parsi Bengali conviviality, if you will. There was this gentleman whom the grandfather of the Tagore that we know as a Bengali person, Rabindranath Tagore, his grandfather Dwarkanath Tagore, whom the British fondly called Dwarki. Dwarki set up a company called Tagore Car and Company. I mean, it was a banking institution and finance, and they set up their own shipping, they get into insurance and banking, trading, and so on and so forth. And there was this gentleman whom I first met as a street name many years ago in Baliganj Place. If you come out of Baliganj Place, out of the little lane from a restaurant called Six Baliganj, and you come out towards what is called Baliganj Fari.
Lovely. Six Baliganj is lovely.
Food sucks. Food
It's
is
very
awful.
nice.
I'm sorry. It's just sort of,
It is nice.
no, it's terrible Bengali food. I mean, it's just sort of, buffet Bengali. There is no such thing as
Guys,
a buffet
next
Bengali.
time you're in Calcutta, Six Baliganj.
Don't go there. Trust me, don't go there. When you come out of Six Baliganj, you walk out of something called Rustamji Street. And I said, what the hell? I could be in Colaba. It just smacked of Colaba. Rustamji Street, and there's this sort of gentleman who came in on the coattails of his grandfather in the early part of the 19th century, called Rustamji Kawasji Banerjee, who came into Calcutta and set up his own operation after having been to China a couple of times. Did very well with opium and silver and so on and so forth, set up his own organization. Like Dwarki, Dwarkanath, sort of got into insurance, banking, owned at one point 40 ships, was director of the Union Bank at one point of time, and Dwarkanath and Rustamji were good friends. In fact, they also set up, along with another Bengali called Motilal Sil, whom some of us may know of as a sort of a pioneering entrepreneur. Bengalis can be good at business. Okay, that's another myth. I.e. my family, for instance, but that got tanked. We'll come to that. And they formed a company which, along with Motilal Sil and co., they set up in order to, Suez had opened up as a future possibility. The canal hadn't quite happened, but Suez was the future. So they set up, the Parsi and the Bengali set up a mail company, which would take mail from Calcutta to the Suez and then on to the Mediterranean and Europe. So Parsi-Bengali joint venture, if you will. And then when Dwarkanath passed away in 1846, my bad, Rustamji, who was called Rustam Babu, fondly, Rustam Babu, Rustam Bhai, Rustam Babu, the Bengali equivalent of that, quite respectful, set up a trust for social emancipation and so on and so forth, which was quite the fashion of those days. We're talking about the early to mid 19th century when women's emancipation, educational emancipation, the Raja Ram Mohan Roys of the world that we spoke about earlier, that's Vidyasagar. The movement of what would ultimately become the Bengal Renaissance was beginning to happen at that point of time. And Rustamji was in Bengal and in Calcutta when that was happening. He was pretty much a part of the Bengal Renaissance, if you will, as a sort of a co-sponsor, if you will, of the Bengal Renaissance. So he set up a trust in the memory of Dwarkanath Tagore. So mysterious, strange, and gloriously wonderful things can happen in Calcutta for a very good reason. Not because it was Bengal, but also because it was Bengal, but it was not because it was Bengali. Because people came to Bengal because it was a superb place to make money. And people would follow, and they would follow the money trail, and they would come. And Calcutta, which leads us to the immaculate misconceptions, because of that, I think grew to be the sort of hub of, as being a presidency town, quite like Bombay, quite like Madras, Fort St. George, and so on and so forth. The hubs of culture and employment and entrepreneurship and business and war as well, and exploration and expansion of all sorts. So people came, like the Parsis came, there were Armenians, there were people from all over the world. So Calcutta was, those days, a melting pot. And this gentleman I speak of, Rustamji, Rustam Babu, was very much a part of that grand Calcutta that was beginning to take shape. And with it, birthing what we Bengalis still live off today. We dine out on the 19th century and the early 20th century to this day. And Mr. Rustamji was a part of that time and place. I think he died a pauper because his bank went broke and he was a major shareholder. But that apart, what a fascinating story of life and times and
Yeah, but there's also something else that, I mean, again, when you think of it, there are these similarities. You spoke about, and just looking inwards a little bit, you spoke about Reformation, Renaissance from within. That's also something that the Parsi community has from time to time done. We know the Parsis built Bombay. That's established. But also, again, whether it was adapting to Western education, whether it was putting their women into school, allowing their women coming forth in public life. So there has been that, that reformation from within that one sees in the Bengali community as well.
Yeah. Well, early Victorian Bombay owes a lot to the opium trade. Let's start with the great Sir Jamsetji Jijiboy. He was born into a very poor family. He lost his parents when he was 15, taken under the guardianship of his uncle, sold bottles for a living before he entered the very lucrative China trade. Now, the Parsis were already in the China trade. There were the Kamas, there were the Ready Monies, and a whole bunch of Parsis who were in trade with China. It initially started off with, exchanging cotton for tea and silk, and subsequently it became one huge monopoly of Malwa opium. So Jamsetji Jijiboy first started off as a young man. He made 4 or 5 trips to China, and by the time he was 25, he had become a fabulously rich person. And on one of his trips to China, he met an assistant surgeon called Jardine Matheson. And Jardine Matheson and his partner, there was another. No, not Jardine. Jardine and Matheson. Matheson was a different guy. William Jardine was a different fellow. So these two fellows teamed up. They made a company in Canton, and their main principal collaborator in Bombay was Jamsetji. So between these two, they monopolized the entire opium trade and became fabulously wealthy. And in the process, the empire also gained, because basically the opium trade it was illegal in China. So the risk was borne by these Parsi merchants, and it was a win-win situation for the British. They faced the frustrations of losses and their ships being lost and cargo being confiscated, but the British got their pound of flesh in the end. But what Jamshedji Jijibhoy earned, he gave back to the community. If he's remembered today, it's not for so much for his fabulous wealth, but for the fact that but for his munificence. His legacy is not on what he earned. His legacy is in what he gave away. So there are 3 important institutions associated with his name, apart from many other charities. One is the JJ Hospital in Bombay, the other is the JJ School of Art, and then there's the Sir Jamshedji Jijibhoy Parsi Benevolent Institution. Now, this institution was also a pioneer in the education of not only Parsi boys, but also Parsi girls, more importantly, Parsi girls. And one of the people who approached this institution to start schools for Parsi girls was Dadabhai Naoroji. Apart from a whole bunch of other people, there was Faramji Banaji, and there was Navrozji Faridunji, and all very big people of that time, now largely forgotten.
No, I was just wondering that, this thing of emancipation and this movement for a sort of a re-enlightenment of sorts, this waking up that we need to be better people. Parsis came, it all came somewhat at similar times in the subcontinent's history, where you have, and here I'll digress a little bit because, that's when the society in Maharashtra was waking up. Gujaratis were waking up, and there was an awakening that was happening across. So you can say that a bit of it began in the east, in Bengal, and a bit of it began in the west, and a bit of it began in the south. But it spread very, very quickly. And here I'm not laying claim to emancipatory influences, because that would be way too Bengali a thing to do. So I might as well do it, right? But I'm just kidding. And we are immaculately conceived, after all. So we're okay. And I just find that, maybe there was and this brings me to the idea that I always think of this sort of grand notion of, say, the Parsi self, or the Bengali self, or the X self, or the Y self. And we forget that not too long ago, we were not very nice people all the time, where I was in our conversation, our warm-up conversation on the phone. I think you needed emancipation because it was so awful. Even when women began to go to school, and in Calcutta, they had to go with what amounted to police protection. They would go to school, well-to-do girls or well-to-do families, because schooling was an expensive proposition. And then when the female graduates began to happen, and I'm not talking about the emancipated Bengali self. I'm just talking about not treating women like, I can't even use the word because we're in Hyderabad public school, but where early graduates in Bengal, in Calcutta specifically and outside, for reasons of history, maybe Hyderabad public school will allow me this one indiscretion, where the Bengali woman or the Bengali graduate was described as Pash Kora Magi, which is basically, forgive me, boys and girls, but you know more than I do already. It loosely translates as the graduate slut. That's basically where our society was. So we've come a long way. It's not the pretentious Bengali of today is born in the pretentious Bengali of yesterday. Let me put it that way. So any Bengalis in the house, we can fight outside later. We can have words later. Or you can come at me, and it's all good. So I keep looking for, I thought it was important to, when we look at a community, to look at a community in its entirety. Where, for instance, Bengalis, and this will resonate somewhat, there is a concept called the Bhadralok, which is absolutely one of the most arrogant things that you can say. It doesn't equate with gentleman, but it's even more at a rarefied level than gentleman. Bhadralok, the civilized person, right? There is a binary to the Bhadralok, which is the Chotolok, which is the non-person. So a Bhadralok cannot
It's a
survive
term commonly used in my household.
without
Chotolok.
the Chotolok. একটা ছোট লোকের মতন কথা বলছে. Like you're speaking like this sort of this trash. I mean the trash talk. You're trash. That trash person, the Chotolok, is also Bengali. That Chotolok also lives in Bengal. That Chotolok also lives in Bangladesh. That Chotolok is saved by the Bhadralok poetry and theatre and art and movies. The gentlemen of the world, the Bhadraloks, the Satyajit Rays, the Ritwik Ghataks, and the Mrinal Sen, the Bhadralok movie makers of the world, are forever saving Chotolok. They've become famous. I'm sorry, am I going on a bit? Rabindranath Tagore made a grand legacy out of looking out for spring and summer and winter and rainfall and love and roses and hibiscus, but also the Chotolok. There was always, we were saving, the Bhadralok had to save the Chotolok in deepest, darkest Bengal. So I think we need to be honest about who we are. And I think then the richness of who we are, the acceptance comes in. And I'll end with one small thing, if I may. There is this other aspect that we must confront, and I must say this because of the times that we live in, is that there is this other sort of hubris, if you will, that the Bengali must ideally be a Hindu Bengali. And of course, a Hindu Bhadralok Bengali. That is your ideal sweet spot of a mix of ethno-religious sensibilities, if you will. All right? Now, what happens is that with that approach, I'll give you an example. When I was working on the book, trying to just finish it up from a lived experience to actually going, I went to Bangladesh several times. And I was in Calcutta at a Bhadralok household, having a Bhadralok dinner, having a Bhadralok conversation. And he asked me where I was going the next day. I said I was going to Dhaka. He said, why? And why would you go there? I said, because, I want to meet some people for my book. But why would you go to Dhaka? Why would you go to Bangladesh? So I said, well, it's in the name of the country. Literally, it's called Bangladesh. It is a land of the Bengali people or a country of Bengali speakers, or however you want to call it that. People who bled to be able to speak, read, and write Bangla, be Bengali, be Muslim and Hindu and Christian, but be Bengali. Yeah? And he wouldn't get it. He just wouldn't get it. And the epitome of this is ironically a book written by one of our greatest writers, an emancipator, Sharat Chandra Chatterjee, Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay, who wrote a novel called Srikanto. A lovely read if you like classical Bangla. In the second page of Srikanto, there is a description of a football match that the protagonist the narrator is witnessing. And I'll paraphrasing, I'll say it in Bangla and I'll translate. It says, Shondha hoy hoy, it's nearly dusk, it's getting to evening. Mogno hoiya dekhitechi, I'm transfixed by this game that is happening around me. Football kheliteche Bangali chelera ar Musolmanera. Where, this is in Srikanto, where, Bengali boys and Muslims are playing football. Now the Muslims are Bengali too. That's the irony of it. So I think it's been a complex history. There's been a complex journey. There has been a wholesome journey and also an unwholesome journey. But that's what makes us who we are. And I think the minute we distance ourselves from these aspects of Bengali-ness, I think we're deluding ourselves into this sort of grand construct of the superior race and superior people, which is an absolute fallacy. All that is true as well. But there is also something called an ugly Bengali, as much as a cultured Bengali. And we must absolutely own up to that. Otherwise, we're fooling ourselves.
That, my dear audience, is Sudeep Chakravarti. Strike 1, 2, 3, all together.
I would like to ask Sudeep a question. Now, both the Parsis and the Bengalis were highly anglicized, at least the upper crust?
Absolutely. I mean, Bakhtiar, you and I are practicing brown sahibs. I mean, look at us. I mean, I'm a brown sahib. I'm a Macaulay Putra. There's no doubt about that. But I can speak, read, and write Bangla. Look at her.
I can't.
Well, it's all right. It's all right. You're forgiven.
I
it's
can only
fine.
speak Gujarati. I can't read or
Yeah,
write.
it's fine. It's fine. Can you speak it? But you carry a Bengali name. That's sort of a carte blanche into Bengali hood. You're good. You're good. Like, you know, Mr. Bose, Amar Bose of the Bose Speakers is only half Bengali. But Bengalis have claimed him for the last 50 years. It's all right. It's not a problem. We're good.
So I'm going to stay on you for a little while longer because the other notion about the Bengalis is that we are lazy, we think too much, overthinkers. Wait, don't react immediately. You wait. That we are overthinkers and that we don't have a business sense. But so untrue. Some of the brands, some of the big brands that we've grown up with have all been Bengali brands. I'm not talking about the 16th century, the 17th century, the medieval period. I'm not talking about the wealth of Bengal of that time. I'm talking about 60 years ago, brands like Sandrele, the cycle brand, Duck Pack, Margo. Any guest house you walk into today also, there will either be a Medimix ka bar or there will be a Margo bar.
Borolin.
Borolin, right? And these are not, okay, I don't mean disrespect, but, and probably these cases are also there where Bengali entrepreneurship started with trading and then went on to manufacturing. But these specific examples that I am talking about is pure manufacturing, pure production based on scientific principles where founders have gone abroad, studied, been qualified, come back and invested and set up factories.
Yeah,
so it's not a one-off.
No, it's not a one-off. And in fact, for a long time, it hasn't been a one-off. I mean, there is a cause and effect. I mean, nothing is a sort of a perfect story here. But but we tend to, and that's why stereotyping is so dangerous. That is why stereotyping is so diminishing, so unfulfilling in a way. And here, I think it's not like the Bengali didn't know how to make money. I mean, the Bengali made pots of money during the Sultanate times. And I mean, most of the zamindars in Bengal were Bengali and they did quite well over the changes of regime. And they were sort of landlords and revenue holders and zamindars and so on and so forth. I call them businessmen. They were basically revenue collectors. They were revenue gatherers, so on and so forth. I'll give you an example. My family, I'm actually from a business family. And the name that Sanghamitra took, which Sanghamitra, for those of you who are not Bengali, Sanghamitra to me, is Mukhopadhyay, but Mukherjee, Chatterjee, Chattopadhyay, Chatterjee. You know, as you would say in the north, Chatterjee, Mukherjee, same, all the same. Yeah, anyway, so I come from a business family. And my great-grandfather, Mohini Mohan Chakraborty, set up a textile mill, one of the first in Bengal, along with another family-run company called Dhakeshwari Mills, all right? We were the two biggest names in Bengal at that particular point of time, turn of the previous century. Why? Because there was I'm giving you an example of close to home. I know many people who are entrepreneurs and business people. Where there was a need felt that there was a textiles cloth coming in from Western India because of the mills in and around Bombay, in and around Ahmedabad, and there was a sort of an imposition of the market, supply-demand kind of thing. So Western India had a stranglehold on the textile market of Eastern India, Bengal in particular. And my forebears and other Bengali entrepreneurs of the time found that there was an opportunity in replacing that manufacture and supply. So they began to make things locally in the British times. Yeah. So there was a lot of examples happening. That, of course, the business went bust, and that's another story. In the late 60s, when courtesy of another Bengali group, if you will, which created the labor troubles in Bengal, during the United Front government in Bengal in the late 60s. A gentleman, a Bhadralok called Mr. Jyoti Basu, who would go every summer to England and loved his Scotch whiskey and strawberries and cream and occasionally attended Wimbledon, absolutely destroyed Bengal's industry and my family business along with it. All the blame doesn't accrue to, of course, Mr. Basu, but I'm just saying that there are various aspects of a Bengali history, and it's so grey, it's so layered that it's a joy to pick through if you wish. And this is something that I've lived. I mean, I'm speaking to you about my lived experience as a Bengali. But I wrote the book not so much for me, but people who didn't know, were growing up at a time when the need to look at history began to get unimportant. The need to look at who we are or where we came from began to seem unimportant in this sort of grand sort of flood, if you will, or deluge of sameness, a sort of a homogenizing religion or a homogenizing culture or a homogenizing people even. If you do not believe, you're not a people. If you believe, then you are our people. Now, I think in this kind of situation, it is all the more important, not for parochial reasons, but for reasons of history, for the reasons of necessity, for the reasons of inquiry, to go back and find out who we are, where we came from, what are we about, what do we think, why do we speak the way we do, why do we assume or presume or squabble the way we do, why are we such agreeable people and yet such absolutely disagreeable people. I think the sense of inquiry needs to be kept alive, and we must, and I'm so happy that the History Literature Festival picked on, among very many other topics, picked on a community history because it's absolutely incumbent and crucial on us to be looking at ourselves and through who we are, not just as an Indian, but also as sub-Indians, a Parsi, somewhat of a Bengali, somewhat of a Bengali as well, but whoever we are, to look deeper.
Do the Bengalis also manage to laugh at themselves the way the Parsis do?
Absolutely. I know I'm hogging mic time, but Bakhtiar is by default, he's a hilarious guy. So I'll leave a few jokes to him because you must. But I'm being a bit greedy. There is this concept in and around Calcutta called and there's a species, a subspecies of Bengali called the daily passenger, the daily commuter. So the verb of daily passenger is daily passengery. So the act of doing daily passenger work. So daily passengery. So there's this joke, apocryphal, but many people have heard it. So there's a local train in Calcutta, and there's this guy, uncle who comes, kaka, mama, comes, and he's late for the train. And he goes and he sort of comes to a window and he asks this gentleman, Bhadralok, who's reading a newspaper by the window, saying, Dada, ei train ta ki shop station e thambe? Will this train stop at every station? So Dada, who's reading the paper, puts down the paper and says, Kano, apni ki shop station e namben? Will you get down at every station? I mean, so that is typically what, this sort of smart alekiness. I mean, there is humor, but, Bangla humor, whether in the East or West or what I call Bangla sphere, which is wherever Bengalis are. I cooked up a new term for this book. In Bangla sphere, I mean, humor is one thing, but this kind of sort of vicious, humor, Schadenfreude-laced humor, if you will, is the lifeblood of Bengali wit.
While that's there,
some Parsi stuff.
the Parsis are known for how abusive they can get.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God, the number of times I've taken oral history interviews and cringed because I know I have to edit out so much from an interview. But
Do you want me to give an example? I think that's the first and last
Organizers,
time.
I'm not going
the
to be,
organizers
I'm
will
not going to be
call
coy
me.
about this.
No, yeah, we do. But the way we abuse is doesn't hurt anyone. I'll give you my own personal example. When I was posted in Pune, I was the boss there, and we used to have this Monday meeting with my officers, and I was lucky that there were no lady officers, so I used to start the meeting with MC, BC, you guys want to work or you guys don't want to work? And then some of them would look this side, some of them would look down, some of them would look up, some of them would smirk because they knew I didn't really mean it. But when after I had finished and my tenure was over and I was going back to Bombay, one of the officers came up to me and said, कि सर आप गाली बहुत देते थे मगर कभी चुपती नहीं थी. So I said, there is no malice inside. Whatever I had to say, I said in the meeting and finished off with it.
Well, that's the difference between a Parsi and a Bengali, because when a Bengali gives a similar gali, he or she means every word. There is absolutely no sugarcoating. I mean, if you're called something, you are it.
Okay, we've had to pick through 200, 300, 400 years of history, sadly. So I'm going to, and I know the audience would want to come in, but I'm just going to end on, for the two of you, and slightly serious note, and then we can go back to our bickering. What's today, as we look at the community today, what are the challenges that the community, I know numbers is a huge thing, and from the dwindling numbers, there are so many other issues.
Numbers is one, of course, and there is also a huge gulf in the community at the present stage. You have the Godrejas and the Tatas and the very wealthy Parsis, and then you have somewhere in between the so-called Bagh Parsis, you might know what I'm talking about, and then much below the Bagh Parsis are a whole bunch of very poor Parsis. It makes me feel ashamed to say
We do
that.
understand what the Bagh Parsi is, right? Okay, why don't you explain the Baghs?
Now, the Baghs were religious endowments given to poor Parsis to stay in. So there are a whole lot of charity buildings and charity enclosures which were given to the poor Parsis by the rich Shetiyas, the merchant princes who endowed these. So you have a number of properties which were given by the Wadia Trust, and those are now under the Bombay, administered by the Bombay Parsi Panchayat. And then there are a number of other baghs which are run by individual trusts. So these are essentially, they started off as charity blocks, but now they exchange hands to the tune of many crores, and the original poor residents no longer reside there. And you have, I know the example of Kushru Bagh, where I stayed just next door in Bombay for many years. There are Mercedes-Benz parked outside there, so-called charity blocks. So yeah, coming back to the challenges faced by the community, the conversion of Parsis, I think, is the major challenge. Because if we don't convert non-Parsi, children of non-Parsi mothers, I think we are going to be in trouble. It brings in fresh blood. I mean, to believe that, there is something called purity of blood, that's nonsense. Because over 1,000 years of miscegenation, I mean, I don't want to sound racist, but there are some Parsis who are very fair. There are some Parsis who are a bit like me. And there are some Parsis who are downright dark. So how would you explain that? Certainly not racial purity. There's obviously been a mix somewhere. But that has also invigorated the community. So this is a serious problem, and this problem, I think, is only in Bombay now. Because the diaspora abroad in North America, Canada, even Australia, New Zealand to an extent, they are very open-minded. They are doing the Navjot ceremonies of children from non-Parsi mothers. And as I said, the most forward-looking Parsi Anjuman is the Delhi Parsi Anjuman. And they allow the Navjot ceremony of non-Parsi.
Well, that's wonderful.
And in fact, I could give you an example of is a good friend of mine, and we know the family for a long time, Justice Rohinton Nariman. Now, both his daughters have married out. So recently, Neena, that is the elder daughter, her children were initiated into the faith at the Delhi Parsi Anjuman just, I think, last December.
And what do the Bombay people think about that?
Well, the Bombay people don't come into it because this is a separate Anjuman. They may or may not approve, but
Enough noise being made on both sides.
there's a
but
lot of noise
there's
being
been
made. So
both
there
sides.
is the obscurantist orthodox people on one side,
Yeah.
but hopefully their numbers are now decreasing, but they still exist.
Yeah. Speaking, just an aside, just speaking of the diasporic Parsi population that Bakhtiyar spoke about, I think just this week there's been a very interesting, for those who are interested, there's been a very interesting online exhibit that's released by the South Asian American Digital Archive, short form is SAADA, SADA, where there's a scholar over there who's recording oral histories of Parsis who've migrated to the United States. And it's just great listening to those migration stories. So yeah, that's just an aside. Did you want to say something?
Well, I just want to carry on the thing about challenges because I think it's only
but
fair.
I want to make one petition before you start off on your challenges. Can we?
I don't have challenges,
You
my
don't have
friend.
challenges?
Bengalis have challenges.
Ah, okay.
No, he is not challenged in any way.
But can I make a petition to cancel, to use today's parlance, the Jamai Shoshti? I mean, thank you for that. I get Karwa Chauth, there's someone making some amount of money. There is some commercialization. Who's gaining from Jamai Shoshti?
The Jamais, I mean,
Tell
what
me,
the hell?
Please.
what is Jamai Shoshti, please?
I mean, what
Enlighten
the hell?
us.
No, I mean, okay, I'll get to that. I mean, this is like an inside thing, huh? Like a sideshow, but I'll get to that. And that speaks to the emancipation or the lack of it, right? So, I don't know about, when you're talking about this study, this oral history, this is fascinating because, we are drawn to who we are and what home is. So you might say that because in this sort of globalizing world and also sort of not just globalizing globally, but also in a way globalizing within the subcontinent, where people, communities are traveling increasingly from their home to other places. There's a friend of mine who, academician actually, called Joya Chatterjee, who's done absolutely stunning work on Bengal partition history and so on and so forth. And so Joya, one of her colleagues, I mean, when Joya was writing a book, and there was another sort of half Bengali, half French academician who works in the Sundarbans. They did a study in England on, they were interviewing people from, those who had migrated from Bengal, as in Greater Bengal, pre-partition Bengal, to, or West Bengal, or East Bengal, and or East Pakistan, and or Bangladesh to the UK. And they were talking about the idea of desh, what is the idea of desh, country, or what is home. And there's a fascinating, you can Google it, you can, Joya Chatterjee, whatever, or write me and I'll send the study to you if you can't find it. And I think that's one of the challenges, if you will, if you look at it as a challenge, because the world is changing, and this is true of every community. Parsi, because of numerical reasons, Parsis have felt it much more acutely than, say, a Bengali, where I think we're just way too many Bengalis. I mean, we're just 275 Bengalis, the third largest ethno-linguistic group after the Han Chinese and the Arabs. So, sorry, I'm just kidding. We're okay, we're fine, we need to be more. But when we travel out, we carry our sense memory of who we are. That's who we carry with us. But after a while, there will be a dilution, because a Bengali might marry what Bengalis derogatorily call a non-Bengali, which is as close to a non-person as you can be. I like to call it not Bengali. I've tried to split hairs. So if you marry a not Bengali person, then that person needs to know their child is a half Bengali. So there is a sort of a automatic dilution, because then you have to respect the other parent's culture as well, and language and mores and so on and so forth. And what about further dilution? Then you become a quarter Bengali or a 1/8 Bengali, and so on and so forth. And so I think there is this sort of grand dilution that begins to happen. And that's where ethnically who you are, to my mind, and it loops me back to my first point about language, where ethnically who we are, or if you're wearing a jamdani, or if you're Shandesh, or if you go for Jamai Shoshti, which is this absolutely, I mean, it's an absolute waste of time and energy over this nonsensical man creature who's fated by women of the house and created as this god upon earth, and it spoils utterly.
Jamai is the damad.
It's a very Jewish thing to do in a way, sort of a Yiddish Jewish thing to do. Anyway, so it brings me back to language again. Because things can dissipate, and your idea of where home can disappear, and it's remembered like migrants. And even in Calcutta, in Bengal, you're being less and less Bengali, if you get my meaning, with each passing day, with amalgamation and mix and so on and so forth, and cosmopolitanism. So then, therefore, what is then a Bengali? The guy who sings well, or writes good poetry, or the person who identifies with some aspect of Bengaliness, primarily the language or a movie, something tactile, something you can touch, something you can hear, see, feel. And that's, I think, over time, all we will have left. And maybe our names. And even those are getting hyphenated. So it's a challenge if you look at it as a challenge. But if you look at it from the point of archival mentality, then there will be fine people like the History Literature Festival and our colleagues over here who will remain our anthropologists and our cultural activists and our archivists in every community. So I think it's a challenge if you look at it as a challenge, and it's an opportunity and an acceptance of the new world, the new age, if you want to look at it that way.
Shall we see if we have questions from the audience?
Absolutely.
Oh my God. We have a mic, Chinmay?
Yeah.
Can you start with the one closest to you? Yes.
We began a bit late, so I'm hoping that Chinmay will be a bit kind.
Hello. Yeah. My question.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Sunil. I'm from Hyderabad. Sunil Patil. First question is to Dadabhai Bhai, and second question is to Sudipda and Dadabhai Bhai. The first question is in terms of the migration, early 17th century of capital and businessmen from Surat to Mumbai. What was that about Parsis that made them more aligned, so to say, in terms of interest with the British? Second question is, if you compare Bengal, Kashmir and the Punjab, you have this coagulation of an elite community being formed. Do you see any parallels in that? First question.
Yeah, well, the most famous person to migrate to Bombay from Surat was the great Lavji Nasarwanji Wadia, the great shipbuilder. And it was after he landed in Bombay that the shipbuilding industry really took off. So, and what was the second part of your question? You said you see, the Parsis served as interpreters and translators and brokers and hawkers and sellers for the British. So they were the first to learn English, and that gave them a big advantage. So they became very closely associated with the colonial rulers and also benefited greatly from that connection. And that connection continued throughout when they adopted Western education, took to Western education, and also pioneered Western education in Bombay. So then there was the Bombay Native Educational Society, which ultimately founded the Elphinstone College. And then you had a major benefaction from people like Sir Kawaji Jahangir, who gave the first building for the Elphinstone College in Baikala, which incidentally is now a hospital of Central Railway. And then there were a number of other benefactions from various merchant princes who really made Bombay what it was.
And on a related note, to just answer briefly, I won't go to the north and the south, but I think the impulses were quite similar. And I take from what Bakhtiar was just saying that that when you had a location, say Calcutta, let me just cut to the chase, Calcutta, which was a administrative hub, a judicial hub, a trade hub, because the trade flowed through Calcutta and Dhaka and so on and so forth. And you had, again, I'll give you an example, that the language of Calcutta Port, or what was Calcutta Port, Hooghly, whatever, was Farsi for a long time, and then Portuguese. So you had to know Portuguese. So a lot of Bengalis learned Portuguese, and then became Dobash, sort of interpreters in that sense. And then the same people switched to English, because that was how the power flowed, and that's how the language flowed, and that's how the income flowed. So it was, I think, a socio-economic aspect that brought people, and of course, this kind of patronage, if you will, brought about your the Bengali middle classes, or the middle classes, period, in many ways. And that I think that happened. And then when Calcutta as a presidency town, and effectively until 1911, the capital of British Imperial India, was also the place which, because of its nature of its being a hub, also sent out these Bengali teachers and educators and doctors and lawyers from this presidency hub, if you will, the capital, into Assam and Allahabad and Varanasi and Jabalpur and other parts. And there were people who went all over. So you had these clusters of sort of trained, these Macaulay Putras and Macaulay Putris who sort of went out to into the distance, if you will. And I mean, there's a definite reason. I mean, there's a causal aspect to this thing. I mean, there is a root cause to these things. And let's be honest and own up to it as well, as part of our immaculate misconceptions, that we greatly benefited from every empire, and absolutely the last empire as well, the British Indian Empire. The Bengalis did extremely well by it. So.
Shall we take one more question?
Yeah, two more questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, sir. Here, this side. I have a couple of questions for both of you. Firstly, I'm a non-Bengali and of course non-Parsi.
Not Bengali.
Not Bengali, yeah. So, and it was very interesting and hilarious a discussion though. And sometimes it was so hilarious that I was wondering whether it's what you're talking was fact or it's just a joke. Okay. So yeah, so, sir. First question is for you, sir, Bakhtiyar sir. Couple of years back, I was walking and then I saw in Hyderabad and I saw a restaurant called Soda Bottle Opener Wala. And so the question is, does Parsis historically have the tradition of surnames, or why do they pick up this kind of Soda Bottle Opener Wala?
No, that's a good question. Now, initially, Parsis had only one name. So there was just Dadaboy, there was just Rustamji, there was just Kawasji, there was just Manekji. Now, after they started associating with the British, they said, no, we have three names, one given name, one middle name, and one surname. So you people also showed, how can you have just one name? So Dorabji, who was in the business of selling bottles, became Dorabji Batliwala. And subsequently, say Rustamji was an engineer, he became Rustamji Engineer. If that other gentleman was a doctor, he became a doctor. So that's how we got our surnames.
Okay.
Otherwise, there was only one name among the Parsis.
Okay. And the other question is
just one second.
Convention of taking the father's name started after the British came in.
And this is not just the Parsis. We've seen this even in Gujarati and Marwadi families hailing from the western part, that there is no family name.
Okay.
All right, there is, you get some kind of, it's not even a title,
So if you
but
were a
each
bookkeeper,
generation just
you
has
became a
name.
Mehta. Now Mehtas are Punjabis, Mehtas are Parsis, Mehtas are Gujaratis. So that's the way it went.
Sir, and the next question is to you, Sudeep sir. And so, of course, there is, misconception that Bengalis are lazy and are very lazy people. But whenever that time comes up, they go into a revolution and all, and they are so attached, and they are so attached to the identity of Bengali that they even threw out the Pakistan army from their country just because they are enforcing Urdu and all. But I want to understand one thing. Here is my question. So Urdu came after the Nawabs and all started ruling Bengali. Not came, but maybe Bengalis got in touch with Urdu more because of Nawabs and all. But Nawabs also ruled Hyderabad or even sometimes some parts of Tamil Nadu and all. But the people, the Hyderabad people or Telugu people, they don't, Hyderabadi Muslims, they don't take, in my opinion, they don't take so much attachment to Telugu or the local language. Similarly with the Tamil Muslims, but what is, at least to some extent with Tamil Muslims, but what is it with Bengali Muslims that they are so attached to the identity of Bengali linguistically?
I think I've mentioned this a couple of times, that, in an evolutionary sense, I've pegged the entire identity of the Bengalis on this this evolution through language and this acceptance of language. So it is it became very crucial. So you have Bengalis, when I say we are a mongrel people, we are a mongrel people. In my own family, somebody could pass off in Isfahan, somebody could pass off as a Sri Lankan or a Moroccan or from Indonesia or from Assam or from Orissa or from Bengal on a good day or from somewhere in Central Asia. So if you go to a place anywhere in Bengal and if you go to many parts of India as well, because of the kind of the mixing that we've had over the centuries, it's brought many aspects with. Now, when you locate yourself in a particular area and over several centuries, you develop a certain bonding, if you will, with the land as well as the language in this particular case. It becomes an intrinsic part of your life. Now, it is difficult for me to explain this to you unless you are Bengali. Now, I have been born with it. You see? See, I'm getting it to the edge of my chair. I'm trying to come at you. Kidding, I'm not.
1 minute left.
Yeah, it's sort of, for a Bengali, are you kidding?
Especially.
No.
But there are no stereotypes.
Exactly. So, exactly. He's getting back at me. Now, it's the link that you have, which has been developed over centuries of assiduous practice. Bengalis are a practicing people. They practice, they literally practice being Bengali in many ways, whether it's through stereotypes or through breaking stereotypes so radically that you've added another stereotype to the Bengali of being an angry people or a revolutionary people or a bunch of Naxals or a bunch of this and a bunch of that or a bunch of troublemakers. Look at Mamta Banerjee. She doesn't care. So, this identity is very core. And you just have to take my word for it. As a practicing Bengali speaking to you. And this, I've gone to Dhaka, for instance. I'm just giving you an example. And gone to the Bangla Academy. There is actually something called the Bangla Academy in Dhaka, which to me is a repository of Bengal's literary soul. Much more than West Bengal. Okay? It is in something called Bardhaman House, Burdwan House, a house that belonged to the Zamindars of Burdwan. And I've sat alongside this person who you might call a mullah, with a cap, namazi topi, white, flowing beard, sort of short pajamas, and a white kurta. And we're speaking to each other about Bangla literature and Bangla poetry, and we switch from Bangla to English, to Urdu, to X, to Y, and that's what a Bengali is. That's what a Bengali is. We are a mongrel people with this grand construct of Bangla, from which draws us from which attaches us to who we are as Bengalis. And our land, have you seen our red, our blood red, our revolution red, our hibiscus red, our pomegranate red, our sindoor red, our alpona red, the red, blood red, people have died. Have you seen our greens? Have you seen our clouds? Come and be a Bengali.
On that colorful note, we shall end this wonderful session. Thank you so much for...
I have a question.
Oh,
This
okay.
is a question from a Bengali to a Bengali.
Yeah. Can we take it offline or you have to say it right now?
No, I think so.
In exactly 10 seconds.
Yeah. The question is very straight. And don't you think we are losing our identity in the long run, and then we have given in? And I have my examples.
Yeah.
Thakur is a title which is being widely used in the Uttar Pradesh region, whereas we still proudly call Rabindranath Tagore and not Thakur. We have accepted it, but we interchangeably use Chatterjee and Chattopadhyay for Sharat Chandra. And the second one is, we don't say or we don't sing Jayo He in our national anthem. We have Hindi-sized it, if I'm correct in my wording.
Madam, I'm sorry,
Say
I really
Jai
have
Hind.
to stop here.
Do you
He's
have
going to
any
be
opinion
outside.
on
You're going to
it?
ask this question to him, and he's going to answer there. Thanks a lot for this absolutely wonderful session.
Thank you, Sanghamitra. Thank you.
As they said, no stereotypes. I often joke that there's only one community in India that deserves to be stereotyped, and that's the Sindhis, because they used to literally sell stereos in large numbers at one time. I'd like to invite Mr. Amit Arora, co-founder of the History Literature Festival, to present the mementos.